Welcome to another webinar from the Axim Global webinar series. My name is Andrew Rufner, and I will be your host today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. So first of all, as you may have noticed, all participants are in listen-only mode at the moment. If you've got questions throughout the presentation, on your webinar client, you will see that there is a question section. Please do post those questions throughout the webinar if you've got them. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, and we will try and answer as many of them as we can. And those that we will not get to, we will respond to later in writing. A recording of this webinar will be made available on the Axim Global website as well as on YouTube. So if you joined this presentation late, or if you want to share it with somebody else, these recordings will be made available. And then ultimately, I'd like to invite you all to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter for news and obviously announcements of upcoming webinars. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Naveed has got a long career in cybersecurity and forensics and is currently with Magnet Forensics. We're very happy to have such a distinguished presenter today, and I will hand over to Naveed and let him introduce himself and then take us through the presentation. Naveed, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Andrew, very much for that introduction. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Really appreciate your time. As Andrew mentioned, and as you can see on the screen, my name is Naveed Asghar-Zadeh. I've been in digital forensics and incident response for a little over 13 years. Majority of my experience has been with large corporations within the United States. And I don't want to read the entire slide here. I hate talking about myself, but basically it's incident response working with APT threats, fraud, intellectual property theft, etc., to running a forensics and e-discovery lab for large corporations, Fortune 250, working from child pornography to IP theft, etc. So with that, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to touch on really what's been going on in 2018, what the state of malware is and how we can better protect our enterprise. As you can see here with our agenda, I'm going to talk about the top 5 breaches of 2018, at least my favorite top 5. There were many. What are we up against from an enterprise point of view? Current costs of those cyber breaches from the Ponemon Institute study for 2018. What we can do better to mitigate those losses through really knowing ourselves, knowing the enemy, how they approach their targeting of us, getting the full picture within our own enterprise with using a combination of network and endpoint forensics, and obviously at the end, question and answers, which hopefully we'll have time to get to everyone's Q&A. So let's get started on those top 5 breaches. Let's start with Quora. So Quora is a question and answer website, and they build themselves as a information exchange site where they encourage real names, professional data to be given that from people that provide those answers. They want high quality answers to difficult questions. Basically, they pride themselves on making sure that you have the best answers possible, things that you can really count on. So what occurred was, well, they should have asked Quora, am I going to get breached? Because they were breached. What basically occurred is that because they were encouraging everyone to provide all that professional data, 100 million users lost email addresses, IP information, user IDs, passwords, data from linked networks, demographic information, all business related, all given out to the bad guys. Again, 100 million users that were breached by an outside actor that was able to get into their database. That was a huge breach. Next, Facebook. I know Facebook doesn't need any real introduction for us. September 2018, user records were breached. Again, something that occurs with a lot of these large breaches is that they keep the details pretty close to the vest of how it occurred. We know that a database was breached here. 30 million records, user records were breached in the Facebook case. Interestingly enough, you would think that they'd go after payment data, but they didn't. Instead, they chased after personal data, such as your names, your relationship status, religious affiliations, birthdays, who your employers are, check-in locations where you can check in on different places that you're at. And for me, as a security specialist, this made sense. It's something I actually tell my family a lot, is that, putting on that black hat, being the bad guy, avoid checking in. Because if I'm, let's say, looking at something as simple as casing your house, looking to break in, I'm going to follow you on Facebook and wait until your family checks into, let's say, you're in Florida and you're at Disney World and you check in having a great time at Disney World. I know your house is going to be empty for a week. Easiest place to do some reconnaissance and find out that data, or I can get into your house undisturbed. The other data that they're pulling, you're thinking, well, it's not payment data, but it's data that they can use to be able to send you emails with malware in it, to be able to contact your employers, to be able to get money or ransom from you if needed through cyber means, which we'll touch on a little bit later. Next, we have Exactis. So Exactis, it's kind of funny. Well, okay, so maybe I have a bad sense of humor, but for me it was funny. This 3.5 billion records that you see here is actually what they brag about, the amount of records that they have. Exactis is a data aggregation and marketing firm. They market for high dollar clientele, and they have not quite 3.5 billion records, lucky for us, but they do have a lot of records on a lot of people. Again, marketing data that they sell to their clientele. And how they were hacked, I typically ask any ideas, but I know you can't answer me at this point. How they were hacked, it wasn't a high-tech thief. It wasn't a criminal insider. For me, it was much worse. It's the type of thing that causes a security engineer type to, run their head into a wall, actually. We had a security researcher that was scanning the internet for database servers that may be open and accessible. And guess what? Exactis, their database was open and accessible to the entire internet. And what occurred was 340 million records were exposed, open to the internet. This was 2018, personally identifiable information, referred to as PII, names, addresses, emails, phone numbers, how many kids you have, likes, dislikes, what you like to do, where you like to go, everything that a marketing firm would want to provide to those clientele, that personal data was all exposed. Again, 340 million records. And it wasn't because of some bad actor. They just left it open. Just misconfiguration and a lack of security knowledge, which is pretty scary. I had one security researcher actually say that Exactis is Latin for finished, which I think the company was finished after this particular breach. It was the end of them. And of course, we have Marriott. Marriott was, in my opinion, one of the most devastating breaches. And I say devastating because I'm actually a Marriott member. So I probably lost a lot of data here. Again, since I was personally affected, selfishly, I dug very hard on this. They've kept all of the hows of how this occurred very close to the vest. It was an external attack. They were able to hack their reservation system. I'm guessing that it was outdated, unpatched, and some vulnerability that was sitting out there that should have been caught and it wasn't. Over 500 million customers were affected with this Marriott breach worldwide. 500 million. What's scarier is they came back and said, no, it's not so bad. It's only about 365 million, which really doesn't make me sleep much better at night. They did admit to 5 million unencrypted passport numbers that were also exfiltrated out. Again, 5 million unencrypted passport numbers and 8.6 million payment card numbers were also exported out. The scary part about this is not only do we have a ton of personal information, PII that was sent out, payment card information, passport information, this information is also very useful for state actors to know where state officials stayed, what their travel patterns were, who they were talking to, etc. This was an enormous breach, devastating. And obviously, as you can see, there is an aspect for the companies that are public for their stocks that take a relatively serious hit when there are these particular breaches. And I think as people become more and more informed of what these breaches are and just how devastating it is for customers as they lose our data, I think they're going to see greater and greater hits to their stock numbers. And this last one, AdHar, this is actually maybe my personal favorite of 2018. This is very interesting. So the Indian government decided that they were going to crack down on corruption and theft by creating an enormous government ID database. And this ID database was going to, was going to contain citizens' identity and metric data. And what they were going to use the database for was to create official ID cards for their citizens, so they could, again, be identified for, let's say, buying, selling, voting, paying their gas bills, etc. What they didn't account for was the API that was built in. When I say API, it's the application programming interface. The API allows other applications to interact with the database using the database's data. Let's say the local electric company uses that API to access the database to verify who you are, if you're the correct person, asking for information on a particular electric bill or you're paying a bill, etc. This API was not secure, and which basically turned out that anyone could access it from anywhere, and they were. So that was one problem. The other problem was the corruption within the government itself. There were several stings that were run, and for about $5 to $8 American, you were able to get access to this database and get a official government ID with your picture and anybody's name that you wanted on there. And again, it was perfectly legitimate ID and official directly from their database. The Indian government still denies that that was possible, but there were, again, several sting operations run by journalists that proved otherwise. In this particular breach, we had 1.1 billion people, 1.1 billion people affected that lost or had their data compromised. Enormous, just enormous. But again, on a government level, you kind of have to shrug your shoulders and go, my God, how do you handle this? It's pretty huge. That had to be, again, my top favorite of 2018. So what are we up against with these breaches? As you saw, it occurs internally, externally, it occurs maliciously, it can occur through, frankly, incompetence or ignorance. But let's focus more on, in general, what are we facing and some of those numbers. Motivation. This is no surprise. The motivation typically is financial. 76% of those breaches that we're looking at are financially motivated. About 50% or more are perpetrated by outsiders. 50%, and I say more because depending on the study that you read, you'll see a range to 50 to 73%. I'm comfortable telling you that there are several studies that I read, including the Ponemon and Verizon Institute. Again, it just depends on how they're classifying those particular numbers. Organized crime groups were behind half of all breaches, with nation-state actors being behind about 12%. I'm kind of dubious about the 12%. The nation-state actors tend to be so good that I wouldn't be surprised that it was greater than that. We just failed to identify them, or we've misidentified them. So let's take it with a grain of salt, that particular number. So insider threats, 30 to 50%. Again, what's this range, Naveed? Depending on the study, it depends on how they're classifying insider threats. So some studies, insider threats are malicious. They're after IP, they're after money, they're thieves within your own enterprise, or they're classified with thieves and people that just like to click on everything. Folks that no matter how much you train them, they just can't stop clicking. So that's why you have that 30 to 50%, depending on how that was categorized. So I don't want you guys to think that, oh my God, 30 to 50% of everybody I employ is a thief, and I need to tighten down on them. That's not the case. Oftentimes, it's just the lack of training. Security awareness training, since I'm touching on it, let's talk about it right now. Awareness training for our employees is huge. If let's say you have 10 people, that awareness training, even if you're able to get through to 2 people out of that 10, not to click on a link, not to have unsafe cybersecurity practices, you've reduced your attack surface by 20% just by talking. This is a very cheap investment for a 20% reduction in attack surface. That's a huge return on investment. The ROI is big. Obviously, I'm big on security awareness training. There are, again, a number of people you'll never change. You can never stop them from clicking on everything they see. But that shouldn't stop you from that training, because there is a large return on investment for you. So phishing. So what did I just say? I did mention that there are people that are never going to stop clicking. Studies have shown that no matter what you do, within each phishing campaign that's launched against your enterprise, you're going to have approximately 4% of people that are always going to click. And they're going to click repeatedly, and they're not going to stop. It's just what they do. It tends to be human nature. So working with the numbers, the bad guys know this better than we do. And it's easy for them to automate, send out 100 emails containing links to malware. And depending on those 100, 4 people are going to click on them within your enterprise, guaranteed. And obviously we have to have mitigating controls for those 4 people, but it is still the leading way to deliver malware. So that didn't change for 2018. 92% of all malware is currently being delivered this way. And as I mentioned, why? Because it's easy, real easy with the millions that we're pouring into our defense against malware and malfeasance from external sources. It's a simple email, it's cheap, and the human factor kind of bypasses all of that. Again, awareness training. Don't let it slide. So this slide we're looking at is a bit interesting. The data has changed, and it's not because the slide deck is old. We actually put this together recently, but the data is still crunching, and as you guys know, this particular field moves pretty quickly. So ransomware, being the top variety of malicious software, said to be found in 39% of cases where malware was identified. And I'll tell you why it's old in a second. So for those of you that aren't aware of ransomware, it's basically a piece of malware that drops onto the PC. It'll encrypt your system. If you have any kind of external drives, shared drives that it's able to reach, it'll encrypt those drives too, and then demand payment. And the payment tends to be in the form of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a digital currency that is hard or impossible to track. That's transferable into real world dollars. And what's actually changed is that they continue to study the data that was coming in. And what's changed recently is that it's no longer ransomware. The bad guys have kind of updated their approach. What they're doing is, instead of using your system for ransom, they're still dropping the malware, but what they're doing is that they're dropping malware that's using your system for crypto mining. 90% of the code execution that they've been able to track, 90% has been associated with crypto mining. And I'll be very quick about crypto mining and what it is. It's a little bit complicated, so I won't spend too much of your time and get your eyes crossed and get you bored with me. But basically, digital currency like Bitcoin, there's going to be transactions, and those transactions are tracked in digital ledgers. These ledgers are called blockchains. So with mining, what you're doing is you're basically making you're making entries into these ledgers. You're making updates into the ledgers. You're basically doing balance transactions into these ledgers called blockchains, and that's mining. You can imagine there's these transactions going across the world in the internet. So these ledgers are huge. The algorithms they're using are complex. So it takes a lot of computing power. But doing the mining is encouraged, again, to keep these ledgers up to date, keeping basically everyone honest, and keeping the money exchanges, the digital money exchanges, legitimate. So it's promoted by people making these ledger entries, this mining, these updates. They're given Bitcoin. As you can imagine, it takes a lot of computing power. So what they're doing is they're taking over your PC, and without you knowing it, using your computing power, creating a botnet, and using multiple computers and their computing power to do this mining, this crypto mining, and then they get paid for it. And there's been some studies showing that folks that have large enough botnets doing the data mining for them are making really about $100,000 American a year, just doing the crypto mining. So interesting change. I found it very interesting. I really wanted to let you guys know about it. Excuse me. It's an interesting deviation in their modus operandi. So a couple of points as we move on that I want you guys to remember, and it becomes very, very relevant to what we're talking about today. The mean time to identify a breach, according to the Ponemon Institute for 2018, has increased from the year before. It's 197 days, meaning that on average, mean average, we're looking at 197 days before we even know that we've been breached, which is huge. It's scary. We're also looking at a mean time to contain the breach of 69 days. This is enormous. So we have malware, we have black hats, the bad guys, potentially rooting around in our systems, in our enterprise, on an average of 197 days before we even realize that we have a breach. The amount of damage that can be done and is done in that time is enormous. So what becomes really important to us, obviously, is history. Keep that in mind, please, as we move on. Current costs of cyber breaches, again, important, especially from an enterprise standpoint. Most of these numbers come from a couple of studies, the Verizon Institute study and the Ponemon Institute for cyber breaches for 2018, dollars and trends. We're looking at average total cost of the data breaches for last year, $3.86 million. That was an increase of 6.4%. Average cost of a stolen record, just one record, $148. Again, another increase of 4.8%. The likelihood of it reoccurring, a material breach, if it's occurred before, you're looking at almost 28%. And that's going to note that, because that's going to be a point that I'm going to kind of touch on as we get to know ourselves and why that reoccurrence is so likely, almost 30% we're looking at. And having an incident response team in place cuts all of that loss by $14 per record, which the large amount of records that we lose within these studies, that number adds up pretty quickly. Other interesting numbers that I was able to pull: probability of material breaches also affected by geography. For example, South Africa, if you're doing business in South Africa, you're looking at a 43% probability of a material breach within the year. Germany had the lowest, interestingly enough, at 14.3%. I read that, I thought I have to take a trip to Germany and figure out their magic sauce at how they're doing this. The breach of 1 million records or more, their average cost to a company was $40 million. If you're looking at 50 million records or more, average cost is 50 million and over. So it gets quite expensive as we move along. The other thing that we have to take into account, and that I touched on before, especially with stock prices, is customer trust. So as we get breached, if we're public, especially as customers get an understanding of the data loss that we've had, companies, organizations that lose less than 1% of their customers due to a data breach, they're looking at an average total cost loss of $2.8 million. Companies that lost 4% of their customer base, looking at over $6 million in total cost of loss from their customer base. So as you can see, again, adds up pretty quickly for us. So now that I've totally depressed you on the amounts of money and what we're up against, let's talk about what we can do. We're not helpless, and we can do a lot to fight back. So first step is really knowing our enemy, what their steps are, what they do, what their approach is, and obviously knowing ourselves. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat this morning. At least it's morning where I am. So what we're looking at here is the cyber kill chain. Cyber kill chain created by Lockheed Martin. Basically, these are the steps that adversaries have to complete in order to achieve their objective, which is breaching your enterprise and being able to exfil data, intellectual property, monies, etc. And we'll touch on each one of these steps. And something to keep in mind is the sooner we break this chain, these chain of events, the sooner we're able to mitigate the losses that we take. So let's get started on it. So reconnaissance being the first step. It's a hard point to be able to stop. It's hard to realize that we are being reconned. The target is basically analyze and scoped, identify potential attack vectors. They're very good at it. They being the bad guys, the attackers. They're using open source, conference materials, social media, public records that are out there, LinkedIn, for example, company directories that might be out on your website. Just be aware, make sure that you know what you're posting, put on that black hat, put on that, throw a switch, think like a bad guy, and know what think about what you would use that for, what you could possibly use that data for maliciously. Weaponization. This particular point, they've found possible exploits, and what they're doing is they're coupling an exploit with a backdoor and into a deliverable payload. Exploit being a software tool designed to take advantage of a flaw that they think they might have found, the payload is the malware that they're planning to install, and obviously the deliverable is going to be how they're doing that, which is the next step, delivery. So there's several ways. An oldie but a goodie. USB keys used to be, you don't really see it all that often anymore, but bad guys, malware on USB keys, they'd walk through a parking lot, drop a bunch of USB keys within a parking lot, wait for employees to come by, pick a few up. Inevitably, somebody would plug it into their work computer, malware would be downloaded, and the bad guys are off to the races. Physical access to devices, social engineering their way into buildings and connecting directly to your network. If you don't have network access controls, which a lot of companies don't. 0 days, phishing, obviously, again, 92% of malware delivered by phishing currently. Installation, again, this is the point where malware is actually being installed on the victim's machine. And command and control, once that's installed, the malware typically calls back home, calls back to the bad guy, saying, hey, I'm installed, I'm here, getting that reverse shell and allowing the attacker to control your systems and start moving through the network as needed and exfilling the data that they need, which reaches to actions and objectives, which is doing what they needed to do to fulfill their goals. So this brings us to us. What are we doing? And the incident response process. So we've got, as you guys can see here, preparation, detection, analysis, containment, eradication, recovery, and post-incident activity. You guys, as you can see with the arrows that we have, it's reiterative process. It's not something that we run through very quickly, very easily. Preparation is key, and we'll touch on that. Then you have detection and analysis. And as you can see, detection analysis going to containment, eradication, and recovery. You have to go back to detection analysis. Chances are you didn't get everything the first time. You weren't able to successfully contain everything the first time. So again, this is a continuous loop until you've been able to eradicate everything completely. And at that point, hopefully it doesn't take too long, but typically this is an arduous task. You move to the post-incident activity, lessons learned, which moves you back to preparing more completely and hopefully not having that kind of incident occur again. So it is, again, not a straight chain. It's a lot of circular movement, but done properly. With each incident, your enterprise will be hardened. So let's start breaking this down. As I mentioned, the preparation phase, It's all about ensuring having the appropriate response plans and policies, the appropriate documents in place. You've identified the right members, the right skill sets, the right tools for them to be able to do their job, and external entities, if need be, to be able to connect to and get that external help if you need it. Identification phase, this is actually a very important portion of this phase. It's all important, but again, from a cyber standpoint, this really stands out to me, is you being able to work out whether you're dealing with an event or an incident. This is understanding your environment, and I kind of harp on this a lot with my team, is knowing what normal looks like, knowing your enterprise. Just being a cybersecurity guy, but not actually knowing your environment isn't enough. The only way we really know something wrong is occurring is knowing what normal looks like. And each enterprise has its own fingerprint, its own behavior. And having that kind of very personal knowledge of that enterprise, knowing what normal looks like, is huge. That way we can pick out that abnormal and be able to focus in on it. So let me also touch on one more thing before I move on: the difference between an event and an incident. So a security event is any observable occurrence that's relevant to information security, like an attempted attack, something like you get some kind of phishing attempt that's actually caught by your filtering system. Nobody gets it. Nobody clicks on anything. Nothing happens. It's your automated systems filter it out, but it's something that's noted. It's logged. A security incident, that's an event that results in actual damage or risk to assets and operations. This time you have a phishing campaign that gets through, and somebody actually clicks on a link, and you have to take action. Malware is downloaded, or attempted malware. You have to take action. You have to do your due diligence to see what actually occurred. Next step, containment, working with the business to limit that damage. This particular portion you're looking at when you're working with the business, you are starting to limit the ability of the business to do its day-to-day work. So you have to be very careful. You have to be able to work in concert and have good relationships with the rest of the business, and know what it takes to actually bring those systems down without causing a lot of damage to the customer base and the mission of the business. Eradication, again, making sure that you've found the cause, found all of the malware, found the bad guys, and being able to eradicate, remove them from the systems, harden it, patch it, find out how they actually got in, applying those particular updates, and then obviously the recovery phase, which is returning the affected systems, and bringing business back to its regular state. And then lastly, the post-incident activity, the lessons learned. So remember that we had actually touched on a little earlier where I said that you're looking at the numbers. We were looking at almost a 30% chance of reoccurrence, because most companies, in my experience, do not do this last step of post-incident activity, the lessons learned. It's understandable. We've already lost money and time working through the rest of these steps, trying to get to recovery and getting back to business. So as soon as you're back to business, you want to start running again, catching up on what you need to catch up on and making money. But the problem is that when we skip over the lessons learned, we can't go back to preparation and prepare to not make the same mistakes. So what occurs is within those months following the event, we haven't made an adjustment, and those same bad guys come in the same way, and we get breached in the same way. Very typical, very typical. If I can really get another thing across here is, please take the time to do that post-incident activity, do the lessons learned, and harden your preparations. do not allow them back in the second time the same way. I realize it feels like we're losing more time, we're losing money, but in the long run, again, it's money saved, as you saw with the amounts of money that we lose each time we get breached. So further along, what can be done? So this is really speaking to proactive versus being responsive. So each stage of the kill chain has a mitigation in the IR process. And we can be proactive. We don't need to just sit there and take these losses. There are things that we can do to lessen the chances of a breach. For example, the reconnaissance phase, there's things that we can bring to bear. Threat intelligence feeds that we can have for our particular business sector that we can use to harden our systems, perimeter controls, identity access management, the weaponization phase, vulnerability scanning, huge for the environment, patching, intrusion detection systems, the delivery phase of the cyber kill chain. You're looking at intrusion prevention systems, email and gateway security systems, network behavior analysis, net flows, packet analysis, security awareness, teaching, SIMs, log management, firewalls, obviously. The exploitation phase of it, a lot of overlap here. Again, you're looking at SIMs, firewalls, log management. The installation phase of it, specialized IR tools, indicators of compromise creation, abilities to search and detect within the network. Command and control, you're looking at, again, at network monitoring, monitoring outbound traffic, being able to detect what's not normal. And 7 actions on objectives, really at that point, again, it's being able to know what normal is on your network and being able to detect those movements. So there are many layers that we can deploy within each one of those parts of the cyber kill chain to be more proactive and try to break that chain of events. But as studies show, we're gonna get breached eventually. It's gonna happen. So focusing on that, focusing on the fact that most of us know that we're gonna get breached and it's going to be 197 days before we even realize we're breached. There's 2 things that I'm very fond of from an IR perspective that I want to touch on today, that I believe that give us that edge from an enterprise standpoint. One is real-time historical full packet capture, PCAPs, considered really the holy grail of network data collection and forensics. And from an endpoint perspective, fast, effective endpoint forensics from the hard drive and volatile memory of that particular endpoint to get that full picture. So I'm bringing this up because it's just that important. It's the 197 days and then 69 days to stop that breach. And a third piece of data, that 30 days saved, companies that contained a breach in less than 30 days saves over $1 million. That's hard to do, but what I'm suggesting is that being able to have that historical means of forensically searching, going back 197 days or more, gives you that edge to be able to recover faster and save more money. So what can we do? Typically, and it's been for the last several years, PCAP, especially PCAP captures, there's so much data there that it's been, I could say that it hasn't been economical to save that kind of data, especially on site, to be able to hold on to it within our network storage. But the next generation of packet capture and being able to store it has kind of done away with those issues. They've become more affordable, more searchable. They're able to quickly assess, build IOCs. As you can see here, we've got the breach detected, and minimum we've got 197 days that we need to look at. They're much more cost effective than they were. I mean, much. Where it used to cost millions, it's nowhere near that kind of cost, especially for holding this much data within the PCAP structure. You're looking at months and years of affordable housing of that kind of data, which at this point is a necessity for us. Searching petabytes of data in just mere seconds or minutes, depending on the type of search that you're running. And again, creating those indicators of compromise and being able to search historically, just huge for us. So it's definitely something it's essential for us. Don't think you're not going to be the one that is going to be, not get caught unawares and not be the one that they're going to have the bad guy roaming around for 197 days. I wouldn't count on that. Again, as I mentioned, the modern technology, you're looking at low-cost storage for massive amounts of data. You're able to scale pretty quickly, rapid detection and response if you've got the right systems that you can pair with it, and finally, the accelerated time to recovery. But it's not the whole picture. Again, as I had mentioned to a friend of mine recently, it's kind of doing like an accident analysis, a car accident, but you can only look at the car, but not the road that the accident occurred on, or you can only look at the road and the trees and whatever the car hit, but not look at the car. You don't have the full picture. You don't know exactly what occurred. And that's where the second piece comes in, which is the endpoint forensics portion of it. So you're able to see the highway, which is you're looking at the network forensics portion of it, especially with the PCAP, which is just so rich of information. You have IPs, you have net flow, you have protocols that were used, you have data that's being passed. It's an amazing amount of data and really gives you the type of information you need to know what the bad actor was doing, where it was going. But once it got there, again, to that endpoint, what did they do? And you need a quick way to be able to analyze that. And for that, it's that next generation of endpoint forensics. And what I'm speaking about, obviously, is that artifact first approach, which what that is giving the investigator the data he or she needs very quickly in a logical fashion. So we're able to analyze that data, get it back, return it to the powers that be, the decision makers, and be able to recover that much more quickly. This new generation is also able to combine volatile memory analysis with that hard drive artifact analysis. So you're able to pivot from memory right to the hard drive. Why this is important is because most modern malware is found in memory. You're not going to find it really touching the hard drive. They have to run with malware. They have to run, and they're going to run in memory. That's where you're going to find its remnants. So that memory analysis allows you to pivot directly to the hard drive and find what it's touched, what's changed, how they've gotten persistence within your systems. So it's huge having both. And then having those same IOCs that we mentioned within the network, being able to apply those IOCs onto the endpoint and running and being able to track that malware down and being able to recover those endpoints as well as your network infrastructure. Something else that's new that I wanted to touch on, I'm very excited about with these next generation endpoint forensics is timelining. Something that I haven't really seen that's coming out pretty soon this particular year is they'll give you a step-by-step artifact approach. It'll create a timeline, enabling you to see, creating really a narrative of what the malware or user have done from beginning of the time to end of whatever you deem is the time that you're interested in. So you'll have a step-by-step story of exactly what occurred on that endpoint. It's huge. It's an enormous time savings. And again, it's all about recovering and saving money as quickly as possible. These two things together again, getting the full picture. I think bang for your buck, it's really very, very powerful. Nearly every phase of the attack within the cyber kill chain includes network activity. Having the visibility into an attacker's actions through the cyber kill chain with that multi-pronged approach, including that full packet capture, flow-based collections, fast endpoint memory and forensic operating analysis, being able to have that deep, valuable insight into the attacker's actions, intent, capabilities, what they can do, having both the network and endpoint forensics working in concert really gives the investigator the most complete picture of what's been occurring across that 197 days. You really can't beat it. It's visibility that you need. And I know I've touched on this before, but especially for small and medium companies that don't have the big dollars to throw, I do have to bring this up that it's more and more affordable these days, much more so than it was. And it's capabilities that are in reach for the small to medium companies where it wasn't before. And this is very powerful and very good news for us. So let me summarize. I know I've been through a lot, but let me hit on the key points. Defense in depth, being able to protect your enterprise, it's essential to have many layers. You have firewalls, you have NIDs, the NIPS, DLPs, email gateways, SIMs, antivirus, etc. That many layered defense is really the only way to go. But you need to approach it with the idea that you're going to be breached. If somebody wants in, eventually they're going to get in. If anything, remember that 4% of people that studies show are going to click on everything, no matter what we do. God love them. They can't be avoided. Historical PCAP aggregation, search, alerting capability, coupled with that artifact-based endpoint analysis, two critical pillars, being able to quickly analyze, contain, eradicate breaches, huge for us. And really, at the end of the day, the faster the data breach can be identified, contained, the greater the cost savings for us. Really getting into the millions of dollars. And having these things really affordable, becoming more and more affordable as technology advances is a huge win for us. And this is, again, relatively new and very exciting. That's what I have today for you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you all learned something. And now we have questions and answers.
Naveed, thank you very much for this presentation. It was very interesting. Definitely learned a lot. I would like to remind the attendees that if you have questions at this point in time, please use your GoToWebinar client to send us those questions, and I'll try to get Naveed to respond to those. But Naveed, I've got 4 questions already for you, so I'll just start right at the top. One question is, your suggestion to add packet capture and forensic analysis tools to the security tool belt makes perfect sense. But do you realistically expect smaller organizations to be able to absorb that cost and build the required capabilities? I mean, that's depending on size. That in conjunction to the things that you just mentioned is quite a set of tools and capabilities that you need to be able to manage now.
Right. So no, it's a very good question, and that's actually something that I mentioned towards the end of it. Those costs are much more affordable than they were just 2 years ago, and it's something that I've actually had to deal with when running my own forensics teams is being able to justify the costs for purchasing technology. Let me touch on that first. Just with some of those numbers that I can give you, and I can refer you to the Ponemon Institute's research that they've done for 2018, that relative to the cost savings versus the losses that we take, the investment, the return on investment, the ROI for these technologies is huge, and the investment is minuscule. Having said that, there's real dollars at play, and those particular investments are much cheaper today than they were just a few years ago. And I would encourage you to look into those costs. You'd be surprised at what those costs are, how relatively cheap they are, and again, the cost savings downstream for saving you from those particular breaches are huge. So I would really encourage you to look into those costs and make that investment.
Okay, thank you for that answer. So the second question here is, what capabilities, and I guess that's relating to skills, does an organization need to effectively apply these forensic tools? Again, I mean, these are tools that we, as you mentioned, most organizations are building the security, this layered security perimeter, but very few organizations have actually looked beyond and said, well, you know, chances that I'm going to be breached are reasonable. So how am I going to deal with it as and when that happens? Then the question, of course, becomes, again, you know, what kind of skills do I need to make sure that I can then actually use those tools effectively?
Another very good question. And oftentimes you're going to get a frustrating answer of, it depends. It depends on it depends on your enterprise. It depends on your business model, and depends on, again, the tool set that you're bringing to bear. The skills that are really needed is you should have a good base across which of knowledge for cybersecurity. You're looking at people that know malware. You're looking at people that have a good understanding of network forensic analysis of endpoints, incident response procedures. There is a lot of good training out there. I don't want to, I'll be happy to, if offline, if you want to reach out and talk to me about what training I recommend. But there's a lot of good training out there and resources with different companies. For example, for even Magnet has a ton of great training classes. I'm sure SentryWire can point you towards great training that they have also. Being trained with the applications, resources that your company has purchased is huge. Being able to leverage them 100% really, again, speaks to that return on investment. So I would definitely recommend training, obviously, in the tools that you have, and overall training within incident response, and having that depth of training across your incident responders.
Great, thank you, Naveed. So we're unfortunately getting to the top of the hour. So what I'd love to do is maybe just give you one more question, and then if you could see whether you can maybe give me a short response. And then what we'll do is, with all of the other questions that we've got, we will, when we put the recording up, and we will send you a link to that recording, we will answer those questions, and you can look at the responses to those questions online. But Naveed, one of the last questions for today is, you know, you referred to an artifact-first approach. Can you just clarify a little bit, in a little bit more detail, what you mean by that?
Certainly. So it's in the past with forensic applications, they've all done really good jobs at getting us a lot of complex data from the operating system, but you really had to work at getting to the artifacts that are most meaningful to the forensicator, the forensics engineer or analyst. I refer to them as the forensicator. You have a tool like what Magnet is working with Axim that brings those artifacts to the forefront. They allow you in a understandable, reasonable fashion, an easy to understand user interface, to look at those artifacts that paint that story for you up front. So there's no questions. The analysis is very quick. Very available to you. And if you need that deeper dive, you can take it in a secondary fashion. But primarily, we're interested in what happened, that story of what occurred either with the malware or the user. And giving that artifact first allows us to answer those questions very, very quickly.
Okay, great. Thank you for that answer. And with that, as we're getting to the top of the hour, I would like to thank everybody for attending this webinar. As said, we will put the recording up. You will send your link, and we will also respond to all of the questions online. And Naveed, I'd like to thank you very much for all your effort and for taking the time to present to us. This was a very insightful presentation, and I'm sure that all of the attendees have enjoyed it as well.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed myself, and thank you everyone for listening.
And on behalf of Axim, I'd like to thank you all for attending this webinar and wish you a very good day. Thank you very much, and goodbye.